superintendent has agreed to make the documents public after the meeting, so we will resume. The recommendation, Mr. Superintendent, are you?
There may be questions of staff. We would present if there are any questions as it related to the three presentations that were made by board members, Dr. Boza, Dr. Frazier, Dr. Beasley, Dr. Bell. If there are any comments or questions or clarifications, they will be available for those at this point, Mr. Chair.
In light of Robert rules, we probably, in my opinion, perhaps need to discuss and follow this as a recommendation or presentation, and then we follow the Robert rules of order. Is that, Rocco, would that be the appropriate step to take? Huh? Okay, well.
Sure. I think there would be a recommendation from the administration about this matter, and then there would be a motion, and then there would be discussion about it among the board. But I do believe if there are questions for staff at this time, then that would be the appropriate time to have those questions answered.
At the, after the motion or before?
Well, I think they need, I think it's up to the board to decide how it would like to hear this information. If there are questions of staff at this time, then that would be something they may want to have before voting. And so I think you could do it either way. You could make the recommendation, have a vote, and then have, make the recommendation, have the motion.
Superintendent wants the questions now, so
okay,
we'll just ask, is there any discussion from the board? Hmm?
Can you hear me now? Hello? All right. Point of order, in light of the fact that we've just received new information, I think it would be beneficial to the entire board if someone were able to respond from the petitioners, given that new information was produced. What would be the process to consider that information?
Mr. Attorney?
I don't believe that that is provided for in your policies in terms of how you conduct your business. So the normal procedure and what's in your policies that you hear from staff, there's a recommendation made, there's a discussion by the board and a vote. Obviously, preceding this process has been a back and forth with the administration and staff from the petitioner. So I believe that the proper process would be for you to conduct yourselves as you normally would.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, Mr. Mayfield.
For a light. Okay, here we go. My question has to do with the consistency between the information that was presented tonight and the information that was provided to the petitioners during the on October 17th. In other words, the comments that we made to the petitioner that they responded to. Is there anything in tonight's presentation that's incremental to that?
Mr. Bowser, would you respond to that?
So we are the petition to respond to the letter that was sent out on October 17th.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yes. We are the petition an opportunity to respond to the result of the review that we conducted internally. And so what we have presented here tonight is based on the response from the petitioner that came in on the 29th.
So this is in response to the petitioner's response and not a explanation of the original comments that you provided. Is that?
This is not so much as a response, but rather after we looked at what the response was on the 29th, and we went back to the request that we had made in the original results that we sent to them on the 17th, we did not see a lot of differences.
You didn't see a difference in the response that you, in your comments, or you didn't see a difference in their response?
On the response from the petitioner.
Right, but my question is whether or not the information that was presented tonight is consistent with the comments that were made in the original set of comments to the petitioner,
Yes.
and if there's anything that's in the presentation tonight that's incremental to that, above and beyond. Can you confirm that?
I am confirming that what you have heard in terms of the budget, financial impact,
No, the entire
academics and all of that,
presentation.
yes. The only thing that we did not share with them, of course, it would not have been appropriate, would have been the comparison that we have made to the neighboring school district of City Schools of Decatur.
Okay. So I take that for the record.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. As a confirmation that this information and the information on the original comment are consistent.
Right.
Okay.
Dr. Morley?
It's my understanding that not only is it incremental, but it is as a result of what was presented before. So in fact, that this is the outcome of what you've gotten over all this time. Is that the understanding?
Morley.
Go on, Doctor.
Can I go? Okay.
Yes,
For clarity,
continue.
it's the results. It's the outcome. It's not where you're saying incrementally, where you're adding more to it, but the results of everything that was already presented. You're looking at the comparison. You're looking at the impact of all of the information that has been presented by the petitioner. It's my understanding that as a result of looking at all the data, looking at everything that's been pulled together, looking at all the information that we've received, that in fact what's being presented tonight is a result of everything and a recommendation based on all the information that's already been provided.
That is correct, with the exception of we have not made a recommendation. That will be up to the superintendent.
Any further discussion?
Yeah.
Mr. Orson.
Oh, first of all, I have a question for Mr. Testani. You talked about our board procedures for a business meeting. Under the rules, or whether Robert rules, we could seek to adjourn to a committee of the whole. Is that correct?
Who said? The question would have to be raised if we adjourn or even dealt with the committee of the whole. The question that you might want to respond to, we would naturally, that would bring on any discussion from the petitioners. What about those who are against the petition? Would they have the same right as the petitioners from that standpoint? So those are just issues and questions that would have to be addressed.
Obviously, to adjourn to a different format of this meeting would require a vote of the board.
It seems that some members of the board would like to engage in.
If a majority of the board would choose to do that, that would be correct.
Okay, I'd like to make that motion that we adjourn to a committee of the whole so that we can have a full disposition of this matter, I think in fairness and in thoroughness and in order to ensure that we are complying with the law.
Dr. Marley.
But there's a motion on the floor that takes precedence.
Okay. If there's a motion on the floor, we will, Mr. Orson, move that we adjourn to a committee of the whole.
Yes, sir.
Can I get a second? Second by Mr. Coleman. Is there any discussion? Yes, ma'am.
I'm having a problem that we're here to make a very important decision. And if the board is going to govern, that at some point we begin to follow our own process, protocol, and procedures, that we do have board norms that govern us, and we're not following our own board norms, and that we're continuously going back and forth. What does it show about the ability of the board to make decisions that are going to be basically in the best benefit of this system as a whole, of the children, the families, the communities as a whole? And vacillating back and forth instead of looking at what we've already seen and prolonging this whole issue instead of doing what we're called here to do is not going to make it best for the petitioner nor for the district as a whole. So most certainly I have a real problem with going back and forth and going to a committee of a whole or part of any other faction that there is.
We'll decide that by the vote. If there's no further discussion, I call for the vote.
Well, I'd like to comment.
I'm sorry, you have,
Yeah. I just think in the exercise of our responsibility, it is incumbent upon us to be thorough, and it is incumbent upon us to be fair, and it is incumbent upon us to be accurate. I think there are compelling reasons for that. I think there is an incredible amount of information of which we have heard a presentation that is clearly designed to be in opposition to it, and that may or may not carry the day. But I think we would have failed in our responsibility if we do not engage in a thorough dialogue. This is a unique situation. We could try to compare it to anything else we've ever considered, and that would be absolutely impossible to do so. The fact of the matter is that we are looking at something that has not been done before in the state, but has been established by the state, and I think it is in our best interest. It is in the public interest to ensure that we are thorough and comprehensive in our inquiry before we make a decision. And it's for that reason that I think a committee of the whole would be appropriate.
Mr. Chairman, if I may speak, after several months of evaluating and public hearings, and the staff has made a presentation, in all due respect, the information was gathered in a very objective way. There was no preconceived outcome in the gathering of the information. And my position is this. And because we've had thousands of emails, contacts from people who support and those who oppose. And Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering, are we now inviting all those who have an opinion to engage with the board? And which I don't have any problem with, except that everyone must have an equal and fair chance to be heard.
Look at the fact when you're saying that we want to be comprehensive, we want to be thorough. And I think most certainly when I've had to sit and go through a document like this is being thorough. This is being able to look at it. CDs back and forth, thousands of emails back and forth. Most certainly, I would not, and I know my fellow board members would not be a part of a situation that we were not going to do diligence, we would not be intentional, we would not be thorough, we would not be methodical. And most certainly, we have gone back and forth. This is not something to take lightly. I don't take it lightly, and the other board members do not take it lightly either. But we're here to do what we were called here to do. We had a board meeting last week, so it must be very important. We're here for a second board meeting this week.
There are a couple things I think we have to address. We haven't had a public hearing on this matter. We've had meetings. We haven't had a specific public hearing on this issue. Secondly, to the question about whether we have to open up this to everybody, there are specific statements that have been made by the administration. And we certainly can take them at face value, but in some cases they are interpretations and not legal conclusions. And so I think if we want to be thorough, hearing whether there are alternative interpretations and then deciding based on people who have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and have a lot of knowledge, it's our interest. Now, we can certainly not do that. We can certainly seek then to make a determination on public interest with an incomplete record. And I think we then expose ourselves to questions about whether we have engaged, and I'll go back to my lawyer role, in both substantive and procedural due process. I think there are some issues that exist before this record. For example, in the calendar that was published, if I recall correctly, there was going to be a recommendation from the superintendent on October 31st. It's November 11th, and there's, as I'm sure the superintendent can appreciate and knows, there's a principle that you don't necessarily have to have a process, but if you have a process, it has to be due process, and one of the things is you're accountable to the process that you create. In this case, having a recommendation on October 31st would have allowed for the kind of discourse and engagement and dialogue that I think many members of the board would like to have to completely suss out sort of what is the right conclusion here. But by a presentation on November 11th, I think there's real risk that we have not provided at least procedural due process that makes us vulnerable. And I think one way we can help to rectify that, maybe not entirely, is by ensuring that the materials that were presented here tonight, that there's an equal opportunity for those who are at interest here to ensure that there's been a full hearing. And maybe I'm unique. I certainly, look, there's no question about my supporting this, but I think there are larger principles here which have to do with not exposing this board to liability and exposure because we have failed to basically engage in a fair process and a process that we established and we stated that was published by our school system that said on October 31st that there would be a recommendation that would allow the petitioners, regardless of what ultimate decision we make, to engage in a dialogue, whether with the administration or the board. And so it's for that reason that I think it's incumbent upon us to try to ensure that we have a complete record or as complete record before us.
Mr. Chair, go ahead. I'm sorry, sir.
It's on now, I believe. One thing we have to consider here is consistency. Last month we had the same type of charter proposal. The staff evaluated the proposal in accordance with board policy and state law. I have been involved with the school district for 37 years, and every charter school that was approved was based on the fact of a process. I'm more concerned about the process, and we are really saying to staff what I'm hearing Mr. Orson is saying, that we don't trust the staff. This staff has worked diligently, and they followed the policy and the procedures established by law, established by our own policy. Read it. It's in the policy of what we would do and when we would do it. And naturally, Mr. Superintendent, I pose the question to you. Did you follow the law, the board policy, in evaluating this particular petition?
Yes, we did. And I think, if I may, Mr. Chair, Dr. Boza may speak to that. There has been ongoing conversation and discussion regarding the petition between the administration and the petitioners. That has been ongoing. There have been opportunities in place that both sides participated in, and according to state law, might even continue beyond this point. So to suggest that that has not occurred is not true. And Dr. Boza may want to speak to that in terms of that process.
Mr. Boza.
I am surprised to hear that we have not followed the timeline because I have the timeline in front of me. And the final review by the Charter Review Committee was performed on October the 31st, 2013. According to the timeline that was given to the petitioner, the superintendent was to offer a recommendation on or before November the 15th of 2013. So we're adhering to that timeline. Before October the 31st, we sent the petitioner, according to this timeline, a summary of the documents explaining all clarification questions, comments, and concerns. We also held an interview, a capacity interview and clarification meeting with the petitioners on Thursday, October the 22nd, which is an optional opportunity. This petitioner attended that clarification meeting, and then we ultimately received their response to our results and our review on the 29th of October. So as far as I can see from our timeline that was presented to the petitioners and sent to the petitioners, we are following the timeline.
The majority of the board,
You don't have
the majority of the board dictates the order that we will follow tonight, and our board norms say we will follow Robert's Rules of Order. At this time, I call for the vote whether or not you have
I have additional comments, I think.
okay, go ahead.
So let me tell you what I'm reacting to now. I think the vast majority of the information we're receiving now is actually contained in the binder that we received in the form of the questions back and forth with the petitioner. I do think there is some new information, including the comparison to the city schools of Decatur, as the staff indicated. I think what I'm reacting to is, over the past several months in particular, the staff has been incredibly good about presenting the board and the public with information well in advance of their meetings about all of the important items under consideration. The process that we're following now, and I'll also note, on this particular issue, I've been very impressed by the opponents and the proponents of this particular petition and how thoughtful they've been. We've gotten hundreds of emails on each side of this, but all of them have been some of the most thoughtful that I've received in my time serving on this board. What I'm reacting to now is the process that's been followed this evening, where we've handed out exhibits that no one's seen, where no one's had a chance to review and see if this is additional information, and where there was initially an attempt to block the public, even in this room, from receiving the same information, to me feels disingenuous, and it doesn't seem in character with the level of preparation that the staff has provided the board and the public so far. I mean, this is an exception, not the rule. And so, for me, the call to have a chance to question the petitioners is a reaction to this aberration in the process that we followed to date. So I just wanted to explain my reaction.
Mr. Mayfield.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is, as a very practical matter, this is a very important decision. I think we would all agree with that. I think we would all agree that we've been presented with at least 4 documents that's new information. And while the process may not allow for the petitioners to respond, just as we waived our process with respect to board governance in terms of adopting that policy, I would propose that we waive this particular policy in terms of how we follow the process to allow the petitioners to at least respond to the new information that they've heard.
Mr. Superintendent.
Mr. Chairman, and members of the board, my only concern is that all parties be given the opportunity to respond. We can't pick and choose who can respond and who we not can respond. So we've tried to be fair and to work on behalf of 100,000 students, stakeholders, parents, and others. And so my only concern in it, and I don't have a vote, is that there is a mechanism so that all parties will have the opportunity to speak. And I don't see how we, in fairness, can dictate one group will be able to speak and not another.
Dr. Marley.
One last comment. Most certainly, it concerns me that when our administration is made seem as if they have not done what they're supposed to do, and there seems to be an attack from a board that governs the superintendent who governs the administration, and they've worked hard at this. We're supposed to be here for the entire district, and for a fellow board member to have already made up his mind and to say that he is, in fact, partial to one way or the other, then we might want to look at the fact that you might want to recuse yourself from this whole process. Because I think it would not be in the best interest of this board to continue, and for us to be able to do what we're here to do, and we're here for all children, all families, for the district as a whole. I think we need to call for a vote to go ahead and vote on whether we move to a committee on the whole.
Dr. Carter, I believe you had a comment. Okay. At this time, okay.
I am entitled to respond. What I've said, and I've been clear, that I favor the notion of charter clusters. And I am entitled to say that. My vote is not my vote until I actually cast my vote. In the same way that I didn't say I distrust the staff. I made a point that the information that was presented this evening I thought was worthy of having a response. In the same way that I think that if we are to engage in a thorough process, I'm not asking for us to convene to a public hearing. That's not intended to deny anybody the opportunity to say, but there are specific points, as my colleagues, Mr. Cole and Mr. Mayfield, pointed out, and specific information that has arisen tonight, that I think behooves us to hear a response to in order to be most effective. Whether we do it in the form of a committee of the whole, or we do it as a waiver of our procedures in order to allow, I am indifferent to that. What I am concerned about is a thoroughness of the process in the inquiry. We certainly can turn this into a public spectacle and say we want to line up 150 people to speak. I don't know that that would be productive, but there are specific points of information raised by the staff in the exercise of what it believes its responsibility that I think would be in our interest in order to ensure that we are meeting our statutory requirements. But as to the personal tax, I mean, we can differ on lots of things and agree on it, Dr. Morley, and I will never seek to strip away your vote, and I would hope that you would have the same courtesy towards me.
Mr. Chairman, as a point of clarification, this is a result of intensive input, evaluation, and discussion from all sides. From all sides. After several months, these are the conclusions. So I'm concerned that at some point, a vote has to be had based on the information that's available. Based on the information provided to us by petitioners, by our own research, we have presented it to the board, who represents the citizens of DeKalb County. And I'm concerned also in terms of questions, the experts who will answer the questions are my staff. And so how will this process proceed? Because the resident experts are the men and women seated here at the table. And I don't want to put them, and I think it would be unfair for the board to put them in a position where they are responding to questions in a forum that no one has been able to clearly define how it will proceed, because they are the experts.
This might work. At this time, there's a motion on the table, and that motion, I repeat, is whether to have proceed with a committee
system. So, irrespective of the school, because I realize administrative costs may actually change places, on our general operating budget, what is the expected net impact of this? And once you get to that, just what are the steps by which you would articulate those additional costs?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. If you look at my remarks, what I said was on a school-by-school basis in 2013, the district spent on these 7 schools, the direct expenses of the school, $29,358,000. Now, I also go on in my remarks to indicate that the revenue request from the petitioner who petitioned as a conversion, not a startup, it's indicated it's also attached from their petition, is $40,392,000. The difference is $11,034,000. Now that's just the pure math of it. Now their number is a 15 number in their first year. Our number is an actual expenditure from 2013. The surprising part of this is they applied as a conversion. You know, conversions are schools that are already existing. But the request that they made of the $40.392 million would cover all of the central office and admin expenses associated with those schools. That is not in accordance with how we fund conversions. Conversions get the direct budget if approved, but not all the indirect or central office costs.
Am I correct in assuming then that under our rules, if we approve this as a conversion charter school, we will only be obligated to fund the schools as a conversion? So we're not obligated to meet their funding request as outlined in a budget, but we're obligated to provide funding commensurate with the students that they currently have enrolled. So the basic question is, irrespective of what we're claiming they're putting in a budget, we would essentially fund them at the current funding rate per student. Is that correct?
I would have to defer either Dr. Boza or Mr. Ramsey in that regard, but the danger is the discrepancy in the status of their application as a conversion and their attached budgetary documents within the petition. If the petition is approved, then implicitly they could argue that you're approving the $40 million figure. But that would be far greater funding approval than we would normally give to a conversion. So I'd have to defer to either Dr. Bozo or Mr. Ramsey.
Could we get an opinion on that from someone who would kind of understand the legal ramifications? If we approve this petition as a conversion, we are, as I understand it, obligated to fund on a per-student basis what we're currently funding in the existing system, not obligated to fund whatever budgetary amount is entered into a document. Is that a correct understanding, or am I not understanding that correctly?
Mr. Chair, if I may, Mr. Coleman, actually, hypothetically, if in fact it's approved, the ultimate decision will be a three-party decision between ourselves, the Georgia Department of Education, and the petitioner. That is an issue and concern we've had, that ultimately, if it's, as in your scenario, approved as a conversion, it still could be funded as a startup in the contract. And we've had some issues and some concerns. Our attorney and Mr. Ramsey has been working on that for several weeks. And Mr. Ramsey, you may want to speak to that point.
You're correct, Mr. Superintendent. The State Department sets its own rules and procedures and policies, and the district has little to no input on that. Once this Board of Education approves a petition, the state rules say that what the local school board approves does not become a part of the final charter document. So therefore, this Board of Education, this superintendent has no control over what the State Department of Education decides to do with regard to its rulemaking. And so to answer your question, we can't answer your question tonight in that with any specificity.
May I ask a historical question? Because I just want to stay on this point because I feel like I don't have clarity yet. Has there been an instance in the history of the DeKalb County school system where we funded a conversion charter at what I read as 33% more than the current per student funding? Do we have an historical example of where we were forced to fund a conversion charter school in excess of the current funds we dedicate on a per pupil basis to that school?
Mr. Coleman, we have examples of startups where we had capped enrollment, where we were forced to fund unlimited enrollment.
But on a per pupil basis, have we ever been forced by the State Department of Education or another body to fund in addition of our current, in excess of our current funding on a per pupil basis of the students in a conversion or a startup charter school?
Yes.
Which schools?
If I can remember correctly, Mr. Coleman, Date would be one of them. There were three. I'm going to ask DeKalb Path. Date and Path. DeKalb and Destiny.
And what was the situation? What was the amount per pupil that we were forced to fund in addition to our existing per pupil funding?
I would not be able to give you the exact dollar amount, but going back to Mr. Thurman's comments, in the contract itself that the three authorizers had signed, it stated a cap enrollment of the student body. However, those schools showed tremendous enrollment growth in their student body population.
But on a per pupil basis, so not additional enrollment, on a per pupil basis, do we have an historical example of funding in excess of our current per pupil funding for any charter school? Not enrollment numbers. I understand the caps have gone up on those, but funding on a per pupil basis.
Dr. Bell, are you?
I'm not aware of a specific example, Mr. Coleman. However, I don't think we've ever been in a situation where we had a obvious conversion charter request numbers based on a startup status with public comments from state officials that they already support the petition.
Fair enough. So my follow-up question, since we're in a committee of the whole, would be for a single member of the petitioner group, since this is new information, at least to me, I know some of this was covered in the budgetary documents at the end, at least I saw your budget, to respond to the claim that the revenues requested are in excess of the per pupil funding, and whether that was your intent and what funding you expect and how that's going to be structured, just a response to the way the revenues and costs are structured as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. I'm Matt Lewis, member of the organizing committee and governing board of the charter. I'd start with one response, which is that in accordance with the statute 20-2-2068.1, the local board and state board shall treat a conversion charter no less favorably than other local schools located within the applicable school system. If you look at the charter school funding criteria, which is state law 20-2-2068.1b and followings, there is a step-by-step guide to how to calculate revenue. We shared this with you in the CD that we sent you on DHCC revenue. The principal challenge here is that if you fund based on the state law using QBE formulas and the district's own student populations, and you calculate local funds based on the state law and the district's own local revenues, those funds generate the they actually generate the $38,087,034. That is giving back 3% of those funds to the district for overhead. The reason there's a $40 million number in the larger budget is because we've included food services revenue in there by the 7 schools. As you all heard at your last board meeting, food services revenue is supposed to be a wash. In other words, you collect the revenue and you expend it on the other side. In fact, it appears that the district makes a little bit of money on food services, so congratulations on that. So the total $38 million is what's due based on the students that are in the schools. I think I could not make a more eloquent argument for why this proposal is in the public interest than the disappearing $11 million that happens when you put that money here before you put it in the schools.
May I ask a follow-up question of the petitioner? And then I'm going to turn it over to other board members. I know everyone has questions. A quick follow-up question, Mr. Lewis, of the petitioner. Just a very simple question. Were you given access to the actual expenses throughout this process at any given time of the school system and able to do a walkthrough from the calculation that you performed and the actual expenses, or is this your first exposure to those expenses?
Well, as I think you know, the DeKalb County school budget's 1,850 pages long. I did go through it. What I did was go school by school, and you have to go find them in your document because the county doesn't actually present this information in a very clear fashion. We went through school by school, and we took 100% of the expenses as shown in your budget for each of these 7 schools, and we carried those expenses through to our budget. We also went through and took the food services revenue and the food service expenses, the transportation expenses on a per student basis, and the maintenance expenses on a per student basis. Those came from your document. We took 100% of the personnel associated with each of the 7 schools and included those in our expenses. And then we added personnel to our expenses, as you see in the notes, which, by the way, is more extensive than was represented today during the operational discussion. We actually have tech support people and additional personnel that weren't noted in the presentation that was made to you. So the short answer is we took 100% of the expenses that are available in your budget document for these 7 schools. And so again, I come back to when you start by taking the state and local revenues on a per student basis and you put them in the school first and you fund from the school up, you find out that there's more money here. When you start here, $11 million disappears on the way down.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Thurman.
I'm confused. Maybe Dr. Bayer, and I'll direct the question to you. I'm confused about the disappearing $11 million. Could you help the board and me in particular understand? I didn't understand the statement as it relates to our budgeting and what we appropriate to the 7 schools.
Yes, sir. The $11 million is not disappearing, but it is a discrepancy between what this organization would get on a conversion charter basis. And keep in mind, we don't get QBE sheets on conversion schools from the state.
You don't.
Okay? And the total requested on their page 1, which is attached, in terms of the revenue number on their page 1, which I've indicated that they're saying that they need to operate in their first full year of operation, FY15. So there are a lot of determinations that would need to be made, but treating this organization at that higher funding level, I think, is treating them as a startup charter and not as a conversion.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thurman.
So help me now. So is it still your conclusion that there is an $11 million discrepancy between what is being requested and what it actually now takes to operate those 7 schools?
As I said in my remarks, to operate those 7 schools in FY13, we spent on a school-by-school basis the indicated $29 million figure. Now, there is overhead costs and that type of thing that we do not give to conversion charters because the assumption is that those conversions are converting from schools that are already in the system, as this group of schools would be. Okay? Now, but this petition request is documented that they want to go up to as high as $40 million out of the system, okay, which would make them, in essence, a startup organization where we all know those schools are there right now and would be conversion schools, and they applied as a conversion school petition.
And so if I may, what you've shared with me is there is an inconsistency between what is requested as a conversion and what is proposed as a budget, which would be a startup. So we have really 2 different entities combined into one petition.
That's correct.
The Charter School Act doesn't make a distinction in its funding formula between types of charters, and the only discrepancy that exists here is that we took 100% of the school-based expenses. We didn't take 100% of your expenses. And as a result, we end up with more money for the classrooms and more money for the pupils because we started at the student level with per pupil funding provided by the state and provided locally, and we built the budgets up. We paid for everything that happens at the schools today, so we took all of your expenses associated with the school level expenses from your own budget. We took all of your expenses associated with the school level expenses. So the discrepancy of $11 million exists around here somewhere, not at the schools.
Mr. Cunningham?
Chairman, you got 2 board members waiting to speak.
I didn't see it. I did not see it. I did not see it. Well, tell me, Mr. Vice Chair.
This is not a community meeting. This is not intended to have denied debate. We've had plenty of public speaking opportunities where people can sign up for our meetings. This is Mr. Cunningham, unless you've been called.
I want to read to you, Mr. Orson. In the discretion, it is in its discretion and as deemed appropriate, the board may allow for public comment during committee of the whole meetings, and in such case shall establish procedures for public participation.
Okay, so have we done that? I mean, before you start calling people up from the... before you started calling people up from the audience, and if it's the will of the board, in its discretion, the board, not the chair of the board, the board may allow for public comment during that. So if it's the will of the board, that's fine, but I think we, again, when we're talking about governance and adhering to our rules, the board has to make that decision whether we want to have this into a public hearing or a committee of the whole where we're in an inquiry process. That's simply my point here, before I get to actually substantive comments I have. So if you are calling people from the audience and invoking this as a public hearing, then I think it requires the agreement of the board as a whole, which may be it's the will of the board. But we have to. You can't skip that part of the policy.
Dr. Morley?
It seems as if we're skipping policy all around. I think that if we're here to govern as a board, that we're just going away from what our intent was to be here tonight, to be having the committees of the whole, to have hearings, people from the audience. We are here to govern, and if we're going to turn it over to somebody else, then why are we sitting up here? Let's let everybody else come up here and run the system, run the district. If we can't trust our superintendent, and we're going to micromanage and can't trust our staff, then why are we here? And we continuously belabor these meetings with not focusing on what we're here to do, which is to do what is in the best interest of the school district, our children, not for political wrangling and all the other things that we seem to be doing. This is not what we're charged to do. And so we've got to look at what's being presented in front of us, and we need to go ahead and do that. These people have done what they're supposed to do. We've gone back and forth. If we're trying to sway people's minds and do all of that, that's not why we're here. We're supposed to look at things objectively and get our subjective opinions out of this and do what needs to be done. And I think we've gone straight away, and it is not in the best interest. And if we're not careful, we're going to go down the same path that this district has gone down for the last 10 years as taxpayers' expense. And I am one of the taxpayers.
Mr. Chairman, I still have the floor. I was the next speaker, so I'm not sure where this is headed off to, but it is still my time to speak, I believe. And then we can get to that issue that I raised with regard to the policy, but I haven't yielded the floor. So may I proceed?
Yes, you may proceed.
Okay. Dr. Bell, I found it interesting in the blue sheet about the financial impact that, before we get an argument over 29, 40 million, for the moment, I just want to maybe we'll argue, about basic accounting principles. So, at your assumption, using the first level of $29 million of revenue and the projected impact on the system, would it be fair to say, before we get into the debate about the 11 million, that it should have basically a negligible impact because it would be offset by $29 million of expenses? Is that not a correct accounting consideration?
It's one approach, but the number I referenced in my comments is a $29 million actual expense component that was the district's expenditures on those direct school costs in FY13.
But we wouldn't then, if those went to the charter cluster, then the corresponding expenses would go to them, so that would zero out. Is that not correct?
Your math would work, but that's not what they're asking for.
Yeah, let's start. We'll get to the 11 million. I want to start with the 29 million because you yourself, this sheet talks about in the first instance that there would be approximately $29 million in district revenue during the first year of operation. So if there's $29 million of revenue impacted, do we not agree that then there would be at least $29 million of corresponding expenses that would offset that revenue? I mean, are you saying that we would keep the expenses of $29 million and they'd get all the revenue? That certainly can't be the case.
If they were treated as a conversion and they covered the direct expenses of the school system, and
I'm just talking about let's talk about the schoolhouse because that's where you started.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask the board member to allow my staff member to answer the question.
Well, I need him to actually answer the question.
I understand, but you have to let him answer the question, Mr. Orson.
Mr. Superintendent, with all due respect, if there are 10 teachers in the school making $10,000 each, and that's probably what they feel like they're making these days, and there's $100,000 of revenue that we direct to the school for those salaries, that would be offset by a corresponding decrease in expenses that would show up on the district's books. Is that not correct?
Your math would work, yes, sir.
Is my math, is that not a correct accounting principle? That if there's a
not in an organization as complex as a large school district, but go ahead, we'll move into that.
Well, that doesn't necessarily help the argument either way, even though I'm not sure that advances our overall collective argument here. So I was just concerned. So then secondly, and this may be a question for you or maybe for Mr. Ramsey as our chief legal officer, you've introduced the notion of a startup charter cluster, and I'd like to be pointed to the statutory provision where that is created, because I'm not sure it's obvious to me that there is such thing as a startup charter cluster, and why, based on the fact that we would be converting existing schools, and our own definitions say that a conversion is a conversion of an existing school to charter status, where the notion of a startup charter cluster comes from in the law. And I know you're the finance guy, so I'm not holding you to that. So I'm going to turn to Mr. Ramsey. Yes, sir.
Dr. Bell has already responded to your question. The board agenda item was worded so that the board could have the very discussion that the board is having right now, so that the board would understand the difference in the impact between the conversion and the startup is for analysis purposes only. There is no statutory provision. 2064 addresses the conversion charter, and the board now has the opportunity to debate that.
So so this part of the blue sheet that said the financial impact will be approximately $40 million if it is determined by the State Department of Education to be a startup charter cluster actually has no legal basis for being in there, because there's no such entity. Is that correct?
Except that I'll reiterate, the State Charter Department has the opportunity to issue a charter document. They issue a charter document. What the Board of Education decides this evening will not be incorporated into the final charter document.
I appreciate that. I'm still looking for the statutory reference, and you've confirmed
I've already answered it, Mr. Orson.
There is none. So, and within our own definitions of a conversion, in this document you provided us, it says a conversion charter school, a charter school that existed as a local school prior to becoming a charter school. So are any of these schools in this cluster not currently existent as a school, other than Avondale, which doesn't exist anymore, but happens to somehow be in this blue sheet? Are there any schools that would be started from scratch that would fit the generally accepted notion and the statutory provisions for a startup charter that are part of this petition?
These are all conversion charters, Mr. Orson. However, the analysis based on what Dr. Bell has already explained to the board would appear to be a startup formula.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, because the first place we have to be is sort of fidelity to the law, and so I want to make sure that we are operating in the same legal analysis as statute. I get there's now an argument over financial analysis, but the first place is to make sure we're operating in the same legal terminology, because we seem to have introduced a notion that doesn't actually exist in there, and you've confirmed that. And so now, we get to this financial analysis, and so I'll go back to Dr. Bell. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Could I respond, Mr. Orson?
Yes, sir.
If you don't mind. Part of the confusion that we're all facing is that the petition seeks to establish a conversion charter, but the organizational structure as well as the budget request is the result of what would be a startup. We've said that. And so that, as you stated, there is confusion because the petition requests the establishment or permission to establish a conversion charter cluster. What Dr. Bell has focused on and what is very confusing is the budget request appears to be, we don't know, appears to be a request that is based on a startup charter cluster.
And is it because the number that they calculate at the schoolhouse level is more than we're actually giving them, or because they've asked for things that conversion clusters are not entitled to ask for under the law? And if it's the latter, I'd like the statutory reference of things they've asked for that they're not entitled to under the law as a conversion.
The only reference Dr. Bell made was to the budget impact and the fiscal impact.
But that's not my question. So my question is, have they asked for things in their budget to which they are not entitled to under the law governing the conversion of schools to charter status?
If you go to the basis of the organization, there is a larger issue that relates to their 501c3 status, okay? We are confused about how you can have a conversion operating in our system which has also been granted or is going to be granted an independent 501c3 status. The basis of answering your questions gets very difficult when you interject all these overlapping classifications. So I would say yes, based upon their 501c3 status.
Okay, so I'm going to have to ask you to be specific, because you've introduced a legal notion, which is about their status as a 501c3, which I believe that the State Department of Education would say that that is perfectly okay. I happened to listen in on a conversation that probably wasn't intended for me at some point some months ago, when there was an argument posited that the charter couldn't be held by a not-for-profit, but we know that the State Department of Education has issued an opinion otherwise, consistent with the law. So putting aside, I'm not quite sure whether the 501c3 is relevant, are there things in their request to which they are not entitled to under the charter law as a conversion charter? I'm not arguing a specific number.
I understand.
All right, I just want a specific example.
The ultimate test would be as to whether or not those things were in the public interest. If they are not in the public interest, then they would not be entitled to it.
I think you're getting to the conclusion before we get to the factual inquiry, and I think I'm entitled to an answer to that question, because the assertion has been that they are asking for the moon and that the law prohibits them from asking for the moon, and I'd like to know what specifically the moon, or the phases of the moon, as my sixth grader is now learning about, what they are not entitled to under the conversion charter law. What are they asking for that they are not entitled to ask for?
If I may speak on behalf of the administration.
Yes, sir.
The law as it's written, the ultimate test becomes whether or not whatever they're asking for is in the public interest. The way the law is constructed, this board, these 9 men and women, will have the ultimate authority to determine whether or not what they are asking for or not asking for is in the public interest.
And I understand that, and for me to make that informed decision as I am required by the statute, I need an answer to that question. Because if it is a matter that the system is inefficient and we think the public interest is maintaining the inefficiency of the system, well, then we have a larger political debate that extends beyond the application for the petition. So for me to make an informed decision as required by the statute, one of the things I need to know is not does what they ask for put us in a bad light, is one interpretation, or is we think is unfair in terms of how the money is allocated, which would be sort of the counter to that. Is there something they're asking for under their petition to which they are not entitled to ask for under the law? This is a simple question. I know it's a complex budget, but if the answer is yes, that they are, please specify.
Yes, I will. I will. Okay.
Okay.
Under our practice of dealing with conversion schools, which are schools that are already extant and exist, and they put in a petition that remain within our system, but this one, of course, has the added complexity of the 501c3 status. When we look at the leap from the 29 or 30 million up to their 40 million, the things that we see that would traditionally stay with us would be things like transportation, facility maintenance, insurance, utilities. So those are just some of the things that would be contained in that gap between the 29 million and the 40 million.
Okay, so let's take the facility maintenance, because that's a really interesting one for me. Because the comments of the staff, if I recall, was that the petitioners had not fully embraced 20-2-2065, which says that the petitioners basically have the option of whether they maintain the facilities or they leave maintenance with the district. And it's written in such a way that the presumption is it stays with the district unless the petitioners agree otherwise. So one of the criticisms, am I correct, Dr. Boza, was that the petitioners had not fully, I think the word was embraced or agreed to, I'm a little cloudy on that, the provisions of 20-2, I believe it's 2065, which has to do with facility maintenance. And since they didn't embrace it, so the presumption is that they were deferring to you, because that's what the law says. For example, that line item would actually stay with the system. Is that not correct? Under the petition didn't ask for facility maintenance to do it. So the law says facility maintenance stays with the district, and therefore the corresponding monies would stay with the district. Is that not a fair analysis?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
All due respect, the question is argumentative, and
that's the purpose, probably.
Yeah, and I would ask, in order to respect my staff, Mr. Bell in particular, that we would refrain from argumentative questions. And as I recall, and although I'm just the superintendent, and the question or the statement was that Mr. Orson stated his mind is already made up. So I don't know what, if anything, that we could share that could change that.
Mr. Superintendent, with all due respect, I'm entitled to ask these questions. I think they are germane to the inquiry. And Mr. Chairman, and yes, quite frankly, what I said is, I said I favor this. My vote is not cast until such time as it is cast.
Well, Mr. Orson, the only thing I'm asking you at this point is let some of the board members have a question, and then you can come back, write your question
Dr.
down.
Johnson,
Mr. Mayfield.
Dr. Johnson,
yes.
Point of order. I have the floor. I'm entitled to the floor. And quite frankly, this is belabored because there are specific answers. These are not argumentative questions. This is a straightforward question. It's a question about the statute, the position that the administration took, and how those are harmonized. And so the conclusion that Dr. Bell had made, and I respect his conclusion, that there is a potential $40 million impact, has to be sussed out in order to be accurate. So one category, if I recall, is about $1.7 million for facilities maintenance, which, according to the district's own comments on the petition, would be $1.7 million that would be retained by the district since the petitioners have not chosen to engage in maintenance of the buildings. Again, I'm just trying to be thorough here, and that's the statute. I mean, unless Mr. Ramsey, Mr. Testani, Mr. Warco, am I misstating what the statute says? The statute says, and I believe it's 2065, that the district is responsible for maintaining the buildings unless the charter petitioners agree otherwise. So in the $40 million figure, because one of the things that Dr. Bell actually stated, was about facility maintenance. So if the petitioners do not choose to maintain the facilities, I'm not sure by what procedure the money for the facility maintenance would then transfer to the petitioners.
Well, it's on their list, explicitly stated that they, within their $39 or $40 million, they have $1,170,000 for repair and maintenance of the facility.
Right, but the criticism from our own staff was that they hadn't fully embraced it, so that money can't really shift if they don't agree to maintain the building. I mean, that is the law, and I would invite Mr. Testani to clarify it if I've...
clarify, but I will read the law. Under the 2068.2,
Okay.
local boards are required to renovate, repair, and maintain the school facilities of charter schools in the district to the same extent as other public schools in the district if the local board owns the charter school facility, unless otherwise agreed upon by the petitioner and the local board in the charter.
Okay. So we maintain the buildings because we own them unless they agree otherwise.
But we also give them $1,170,000?
No, I think we don't give them $1,170,000. And that is, I think that goes to Mr. Coleman's question about what do they ask for and what goes to the petitioners. If there's agreement, budgets are categorical, as you know better than anybody in this room. So if they don't accept the responsibility for the maintenance of the building, it seems to me clear that they don't get the money that goes with it. But that seems to me to be a contractual question and not sort of their kind of broader, do they meet the requirements of the petition? But let me go on to other categories. Yeah. No, it's a point of order. Yeah, it takes precedence.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just had a question for our attorneys, and this is not a reflection on the current speaker, it's a reflection on the nature of the debate, and I know there have only been a few of us who have spoken so far, and I think it would benefit us to have a diversity of perspectives. Is there a provision within Robert's Rules of Order to limit the amount of time for given questioners and speakers, not to limit the number of times they can speak, certainly, but to limit the amount of time dedicated to any question or answer just so that we can make sure to cycle through diverse perspectives? It's a parliamentary question.
Thank you,
if
Mr. Coleman. Thank you, Mr. Coleman.
Now that you're in the committee of the whole, the procedure for ending the debate would be to rise and report as a committee of the whole to conclude the debate. I think the question you've asked, Mr. Coleman, goes to the general rule will be 10 minutes, but you're in a committee of the whole, and you didn't specify limitations at the beginning. However, your point is a practical point, and it's one of board relationship, and I would think the board would want to act in accordance with that understanding.
So, just so I'm clear, so there's not a specific provision to limit the amount of time any given speaker or questioner from the board can speak. We just have to limit the total amount of time of debate, or we can kind of continue with the amount of time that each board member feels appropriate.
It could have been done at the beginning of going into the committee of the whole. Now that you're not at the beginning, you can rise and report to adjourn. But my point to you is, yes, there is a limitation on the number of times someone can speak, but in terms of the time limitations, there's not an express one. There is in other settings under Robert's Rules of 10 minutes. And so that's my point back to you, is that this is ultimately a board process, and I leave it to you to continue your process.
Thank you, Mr. Mayfield, and then followed by Dr. Carter and Dr. Morley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got three categories, I guess, of questions, and hopefully we'll limit them to three questions. The first one has to do with the deliberations that we're taking right now. Because we're talking public interest, that's the discussion. I want to make sure that we distinguish the two components of our assessment and get some determination on what the first half, the status of the first half. The two pieces of our assessment have to do with the compliance of the petition as it relates to Georgia Code, and secondly, whether or not it is in the best interest. And as an academic matter, it would seem to me that if we can get some determination on the status of the petition, absent the public interest component, it would be helpful, at least in terms of guiding the rest of my questions. So can we get some determination about the status, whether or not the petition itself is in compliance?
Mr. Bowser.
Mr. Mayfield, I would have to refer back to my opening comments where we talked about that four-prong test that is part of policy IBB. And the first one is to demonstrate that the proposed program as set forth in the charter petition do not duplicate existing DeKalb programs or exist in any DeKalb County schools. And it appears, based on the petitioner's response from the original and the second submission that was turned into the district on October the 29th, that what they are offering is a repeat of existing DeKalb County programs,
Right, but
curricular program.
I'm sorry. Right, but my understanding is that that particular portion of the policy speaks to definition of public interest, not to the compliance of the document itself to the guidelines and the code.
You are correct in that, because that is actually what we have used to determine as to, in our review of the petition, as to whether it is in the public interest as well.
Right. So can I conclude then that the petition itself is in fact in order, and that it is an assessment that the board needs to make as to whether or not it is in the public interest?
Absolutely, sir.
So
that would be the discretion of the board.
Right. So the petition is in order.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So my questions regarding the public interest piece. I've got 3 financial questions and 1 academic question. Two financial questions and 1 academic question. Actually, I guess I do have a 4th one as it relates to the organizational structure. So I apologize. So I do apologize. Financially, are there any guidelines, and maybe this speaks to the discussion that Mr. Orson was having, are there any guidelines that would prohibit the school district from funding beyond the conversion model?
Our practice is to fund existing schools that convert under the conversion model. My remarks related to the financial risk and liability associated with approving the petition relative to the school district's fiscal status right now, and relative to the list of revenue items they would like funded up to the $40 million level. I think a guideline that would be violated would be just good fiscal policy.
Right. So when we move into the contract phase, and this is sort of referring to some of the earlier comments having to do with whether or not the state's 3-party contract has to comply with the petition and its budget, can we presume that we have a strong argument in those negotiations regarding the terms and conditions that the amount of funding should be limited to the conversion model as compared to the startup model?
If I could answer that, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thurman.
My answer would be no.
Okay. My second question really is to the petitioners regarding the financial piece. The part that most concerns me on the financials on the public interest side is that the petition proposes to increase teacher salaries and reduce class size based on the current allocation per student. And so my question has to do with how would you close that gap? Because mathematically you would presume that if you do both, then that the actual cost would actually rise.
So thank you, Mr. Mayfield. I think the shortest, quickest answer to your question goes back to the debate that's been ongoing here. We have taken 100% of the expenses associated with these 7 schools as defined in the DeKalb County School District 2014 budget.
Wow.
We have taken 97% of the revenue as defined by the state QBE formula for QBE funding and local district funding based on the local taxes in the 2014 DeKalb County School District budget. So we've taken all the school expenses and we have taken the revenue that is due to us. When you put those 2 things together, you get the budget that we presented you. The $11 million difference, plus or minus a little bit, is part of how you do what we are doing. Instead of funding overhead at the central office level, we are funding teaching in the classrooms.
So my follow-up question to that would be that if for whatever reason the state board did not agree with the superintendent and in fact would limit you to the funding based on the conversion model, how would you respond to that in your budget?
Mr. Mayfield, I'm not aware of any statutory basis for a conversion funding model. There is only a statutory basis for charter funding, and it's very clear, and it is outlined in the packet that we gave you. And we use that formula to determine the revenue on a per-student basis that flows through from the state and local funds. This notion of a conversion model is based on practice of the county and the district. It's not based on statute.
Right. But I guess my concluding question on the financial piece then would have to do with whether or not it would create a budgetary problem for the charter if in fact you were only allocated based on the current practices.
Well, if we were allocated based on the current practices, that would be a violation of the statute.
Oh, okay. Now, my question on the academics. What's been presented to us obviously would be of concern, given that essentially Dr. Beasley has presented a scenario where nothing, or mostly nothing, would be new. Could you respond to that in terms of the academic program?
Good evening. My name is Kathleen Mathers, and I have not had the opportunity to study Exhibit 4 in great depth, but I would say my suggestion would be to move back from a surface-level checklist purview of the petition and instead look at the bigger picture of what we're offering here. In terms of your innovative opportunities, we are talking about seamless K-12 pathways. We are not talking about individual schools. We are talking about looking at one large K-12 pathway that offers choice enrollment for students based on their individual needs. I would push on the fact that we shouldn't focus on the label necessarily as we focus on the fidelity of implementation. In other words, it's not the what, it's the how we're going to do it that makes a difference. When you have a seamless delivery of services, when you bring decision-making down to the classroom level, when you empower teachers and school leaders to decide on their own instructional resources, their assessment materials aligned specifically to the needs of the kids sitting before them, you do get a different product. K-12 vertical planning is a huge piece of this that connects the beginning to the end. In terms of the duplication, again, we're talking about labels there. It comes down to fidelity of implementation. Pre-K, Montessori, AP, IB, STEAM, curriculum grounded in GPS and CCGPS. Again, how are you going to implement those programs? Certainly you wouldn't suggest that we not incorporate pre-K or that we move away from advanced placement or international baccalaureate because it's the same name. It's the fidelity of implementation that's going to make the difference here. And to implement those programs rigorously within the context of a college and career-ready curriculum that's been established within the state by national experts and nationally by experts across the country. Not a duplication of services, it's how we're going to do things fundamentally differently within those labels because of the flexibility that you give to us in exchange for higher accountability.
And if you could indulge me, when we look at it at that high level, if you were to take an example of what currently takes place and describe the difference that the charter would provide, how would you articulate the difference in performance or outcomes you would expect based on that example?
You've already brought up lower class size. You've brought up increased salaries for teachers. That brings up the morale. The flexibility that we get through our waivers empowers teachers to make decisions based on the materials that they're going to use, how they're going to spend their time in their classroom, how they're going to assess their students, how they're going to use those results to drive instruction forward. And certainly, when we talk about the accountability piece here, we're largely held accountable by state assessments. So certainly it makes sense, it's altogether appropriate for the curriculum to be based on the Georgia Performance Standards or the Common Core Georgia Performance Standards.
Okay, well, let me bring it a little closer to the ground then. Can you give me a specific example of how the service is being delivered now that you would change, and what would that change look like?
Well, we're starting at the classroom level. That's the key to all of this. And that's the point that I'm trying to push hard on here. I think that in the current model, where decision-making happens at a much higher level, and it's happening for 99,000 students instead of for 5,000 students. You get a product that is not customized, not targeted, not strategic based on the needs of those kids. You also have a difference in the resource allocation that goes along with that. So if you are going to implement a program like advanced placement, like IB, like those that have been mentioned here, but you don't fully fund those, or you don't fully follow the protocols that have been established to be a part of those programs, you can't expect to get the same kinds of results.
Okay. My last question actually has to do with the organizational makeup, so I'm not sure if you're the person that's going to answer that or not. But it has to do with the difference between the size of the Decatur district office, if you will, and the size of the Charters district office. There is a 6-to-1 ratio there, and I'm curious as to how that model would work, and Decatur hasn't tried it. And it's really not a question to define how Decatur should do this. I'm just curious as to how we can reduce it by 5-6.
So we may not be able to. The objective of the petition is to put principals in charge of their schools and teachers in charge of their classrooms. And during the course of construction of the petition, in the working groups that teachers and administrators participated in, they asked for the responsibility to do things like form their own curriculum and build their own vertical curriculum teams across the schools so that they could do that work. We have added a cluster administrative officer to support all of our principals in their decision making. We've added a CFO to support the budgeting. We've added 5 technology support people to support technology. We have added data assessment personnel to support the new assessment methods that we're putting in place. We may need more than that, but as you see from the budget, we have a surplus. I know that's unusual, but we do. In addition to that, the board itself is constructed of a specific set of expertise in order to support, especially in the early days, the development of all of this program. So you see Kathleen Mathers, former head of the office of the Governor's Office on Educational Excellence, Robert Thorpe, former principal of our middle school and multi-year veteran of both this system and Gainesville system. You see Teresa Bennett, paralegal with the Georgia Health Department, who oversees hearings associated with additional needs in that area. You see Dave Roberts, a partner at KPMG, whose specialty is in operational excellence and operational management. Next to him, Scott Bonder, who is a legal expert to provide legal support. And next to him, last but not least, Fred Daniels, who is Chief Credit Officer of one of the nation's largest minority-owned financial institutions and currently chairman of MARTA. So we have built support into the board structure itself, as well as maintained a surplus so that we can read and react as our principals and administrative officer and CFO are on the ground building this program.
So should I conclude from that, if I could close this with this final question, should I conclude from that essentially what you would do is to take the 24 remaining, the responsibilities that would be associated with this 24, I'm using this 24 just as a proxy, that essentially the principals would absorb those responsibilities?
Yeah, so I would just stipulate that I don't necessarily accept the 24 figure. I have no idea what Decatur does with those. No disrespect to Decatur, but that's not a model that we use from an operational perspective. We would say that principals will take a significant amount of responsibility that currently is being done in the central office, and we would say that teachers will take a significant amount of responsibility that is currently being done in the central office, and we would say that our cluster administrative officer, CFO, and the other support staff positions that I mentioned to you would take responsibilities that are currently being done at the central office. We think they can do them more efficiently, but at our size, we can read and react much faster.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Carter, Mr. Superintendent wanted to respond to one of the questions. Okay.
Well, I would like for Dr. Beasley, we did conduct a significant amount of research regarding the whole issue of class size and teacher salaries that are being proposed. and I think the board could benefit from hearing his analysis based on the petition and what was presented along with the budget that was presented. The only issue I raise is that, we could not consider anything not encompassed in the petition itself.
Thank you, Mr. Thurman. A few comments. In the petition, the class size targeted has been reduced. However, we were not able to reconcile the budget as proposed by the petitioners that basically conveys that they would keep the same amount of teachers with reduced class size. We're not able to reconcile as we know, the increase in the number of teachers that would be warranted if you significantly reduce class sizes. If you would look at Exhibit 4, number 24, I'd like to bring to your attention DeKalb's current class sizes and the proposed targeted class size for the proposed cluster. According to their projected budget, currently for the fiscal year 2015, they're proposing 345 teachers. There is no decrease reflected in that number from what's currently being done within the cluster. So again, we were not able to reconcile how the budget would accommodate for the increased number of teachers that would be required at a targeted reduction in class size. Additionally, if you would look at Exhibit 4, please note that the mark you see is not a checklist. It is an indication to you as board members that we have done an extensive analysis of what is offered here in DeKalb County Schools for all 100,000 students compared to what is being proposed in the charter cluster. We've noted for you differences, if they exist. It is our opinion, after a thorough analysis, that there is nothing unique about what is being proposed when we compare it to what is currently being offered in DeKalb County School District. As it pertains to programming or program implementation, please know that in our district, we are within a decentralized environment to a degree. But as you know, autonomy often occurs with parameters. DeKalb has a curriculum. We developed our curriculum using state standards. The petitioner proposes to use state standards, the same standards that DeKalb has used to develop its curriculum. Fidelity was mentioned. Fidelity, there is nothing in the district at this point that would preclude any school, any cluster, any group of schools from improving their fidelity. As a matter of fact, this administration has uniquely positioned itself to support innovation and fidelity as it pertains to implementation of the curriculum or any programs that would extend to our students opportunities to improve their outcomes. As it pertains to AP, you will note in Exhibit 4, number 10, DeKalb offers AP courses. The cluster plans to continue. All of DeKalb's AP programs are supported and certified by AP College Board. The fidelity of implementation in DeKalb is recognized by the designation by College Board that we can offer these AP courses. If there are opportunities to improve classroom instruction, and there are, DeKalb continues to support our teachers as they work to improve teacher quality and delivery of the curriculum. That can occur today, and there is nothing that would preclude any school in our district currently from improving the fidelity of implementation of the curriculum.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, and the point, and look, we work to get charter petitions approved. We work intensively with petitioners, ongoing, formally and informally, to address any issues or concerns. Our goal is not to reject petitions. What Dr. Beasley mentioned is one of the issues that we were unable to resolve as it relates to reduced class size. The budget proposes the exact same number of teachers, am I right?
To the degree, yes, sir.
To a degree that we have now. But the petition asserts a major effort to reduce class size. So it was difficult for my staff to resolve what appears to be an inherent conflict. And so that's what he's raising. Not that it can't be, it's just all we could go on was the petition and any collateral documentation provided to us to evaluate. There's nothing else. There may be broader visions and understandings, but we can only evaluate what is there written in black and white.
I think I can probably help.
Okay.
Mic on for that to happen. Oh, there it is. Point of order, and this is not a reflection on anyone speaking right now. Just ensure the clean flow of conversation. What is the process for recognizing respondents? Because I see a lot of people want to get in right now. My impression is Mr. Mayfield has the floor for questions. What is the process by which people can be recognized to speak? Because I don't want to enter a situation where people are just kind of randomly jumping in. And that's not a reflection on anyone speaking right now. I just want to make sure we have control of the process.
So there's a point of clarification here that's directly responsive.
I've got to ask that, just a point of clarification on the recognition of speakers.
Again, this is a board process. I would agree with you, Mr. Coleman. You do want to stick to a process that is organized. And so I think the board should determine how it will proceed in terms of recognizing speakers, and that would be a decision of the board at this time.
Protocol, Dr. You will finish, Mr. Mayfield, and after which, Dr. Carter.
Can we just stay on this point for a moment, if Mr. Mayfield allows? Oh, I'm sorry.
To get this cleared as well, before I ask my final question, if I could, and I wanted to yield some time to Dr. Carter, if I could, to do that.
Mr. Chairman, if you might, what I would propose that we accept in the vision of what we have said we would do in good board relationships and engagement is allow the speaker who is raising the questions from the board to ask 3 questions and allow staff and respondent to respond one time each, that we might move this along in a reasonable manner unless there is a problem with clarification from the question coming from the board member.
We have that as a suggestion, and at this time, I guess the best way to do it is, would you put it in terms of a motion?
I would move, Mr. Chairman, in order for this to move efficiently, effectively, and in the positive manner in which we have proposed to operate as a board, that its board members seek to inquire that they would limit themselves to 3 questions, providing an opportunity for staff and the petitioner to respond to those questions, and that we would only revisit something if the board member lacks clarity in the question asked, not an extension thereof.
Can I get a second? Second by Dr. Irwin. Is there any discussion? Call for the vote. Since our technology, It's not working. Let me know by a show of hands. It's unanimous.
So my final question that I would like to ask Dr. Beasley, okay, thank you, has to do with the fidelity of the programs and the notion that how matters as much. And you mentioned that there are things that could be done, presuming that there are things that are not being done now. So could you elaborate a little bit to tell us what you think those deficits are?
Well, I would submit to the board that currently the entire district is engaged in the strategic planning process. Within that process, areas of improvement have surfaced or are surfacing to a point that they're being recognized and identified. Clearly, from classroom to classroom, school to school, there is room for improvement. Specifically, depending on where you go, it depends.
Yeah, and I'm speaking specifically in this cluster and specific things that are not happening now, with the strategic plan notwithstanding, the things that are not happening now that, in your opinion, should be happening.
Well, based upon my review of the cluster's data, based upon the plans that many of the schools have in place, they are doing or they've implemented current best practices related to assessing students, identifying how to address the deficits that students have, improving the quality of classroom instruction, being very innovative in the classrooms, whether they're using authentic measures or ways to assess students or various methodologies for presenting the content. Those things are occurring within the cluster today, as the petitioner has clearly documented that they would continue many of the practices that are occurring in DeKalb County School District.
Final question then. So is it your conclusion that seamless pathways between elementary, middle school, and high schools have no value?
It is my conclusion that DeKalb County Schools leads this state in pathway completion. Therefore, the petitioner duplicates what DeKalb currently leads in the state.
You finished? Okay. Dr. Carter, you done? Who's next? Oh,
Miss.
Okay. Call your name, please, if you will.
Robert Thorpe. I'm the past principal of Druid Hills Middle School, and I'd like to speak just a moment on the issue of fidelity when we talk about having the same programs but implementing them with fidelity. Since Druid Hills Middle School is a IB middle school, in fact, it was the first IB middle school in DeKalb County, and within the state, we were like number 6 that was authorized in the state for IB. Let me share some things about how we can implement this with fidelity. One of the things that IB requires is that it requires all teachers to be trained in the IB implementation. We currently don't have all teachers trained, and one of the reasons we don't have a mechanism of requiring teachers to be trained so they can implement the IB program with fidelity. And as you may know, Druid Hills Middle School this year will be undergoing the 5-year reevaluation, and these types of issues will be called noted. Number 2, there's no coordination between the schools with respect to IB. And when we talk about a continuous pathway from kindergarten through 12th grade, there needs to be some coordination. There needs to be someone with the experience to be able to coordinate the program. Additionally, there's IB also requires an assessment that's different from what we typically do is give numerical grades. IB requires that we give descriptive grades to students. In other words, when you give a student a grade of 85, what does it really mean? what does the student know and is able to do? There's no description in that. IB requires that descriptive grading policy. Also, a huge part of IB is the community service component. I've worked along with the district for the last 3 years in order for us to be able to identify community service hours within our ESIS student information system. There is a place in ESIS that does have the community service hours where they can be documented. I've asked our IT department for 3 years to get that up to speed to where we could utilize that, because IB intention is to make students become community minded. Thank you.
We didn't put a number there, but if you all want to vote on that. Did we have a number? One? You okay with that? Okay. Dr. Carter, you finished, right? Okay. Mr. Campbell?
Question is a very simple question. Minus the $11 million discrepancy, either way. Hopefully, can you hear me now? Minus the $11 million discrepancy. I don't want to address that at all. But not considering that implication at all, are there any conditions that will exist if we allow the charter to be, if we approve the charter, are there any financial conditions that could possibly impact the financial position in the district, being long-term credit ratings or the financial position itself?
Well, one of the exhibits, I think it might be exhibit number 2, that was distributed as a white paper published by Moody's Investor Service on October 15th nationally. It's not a white paper that we even knew was coming, but it's a very good high-level examination of what Moody's, one of the 2 or 3 principal credit rating agencies, feels are the financial threats to large urban school districts resulting from the growth of charter schools. Now, it's primarily in the Midwest and on the East Coast, but I think y'all got a copy of that document, and it talks about certain threats to the financial status of large urban school districts resulting from charter school growth. One of them in particular is the issue of the inability of certain school districts to adjust their expenses quickly when funds or revenue is allocated over to a charter school. Okay? That sort of speaks to my concern about this $11 million figure. The petitioner's request in this regard, it really is to just sort of take over and set up their own complete school system, even though they apply it as a conversion, okay? Depending upon how the ultimate economics on our side, how we can adjust, okay, it could have a negative financial impact. Maybe not to the extent of what Moody's describes, but keep in mind, Moody, because of our FY 2012 experience, Moody just recently did downgrade us about a half a tick.
So as I suspect, first of all, I guess I should stipulate that I don't know that we're all ready to endorse Moody's given the trouble they got us in the past, credit crunch. But I think Dr. Bell's aware, and I suspect that each of you are aware if you actually read the exhibit that he's talking about, that Moody's analysis does 2 things that's very important. One of them is it specifically calls out the South as a success zone, not a trouble zone. The second is that it is in conversation and in direct comparison of startup charter schools, not conversion charter schools. And the reason for that is that when you have a startup charter school in a district, the district still has the obligations associated with the remaining schools from which those students leave. We have a great example of that in Avondale. The student population at Avondale Elementary School was dramatically impacted by the startup charter Avondale Museum School. When you lose revenue from a school that you have to continue running, you get in trouble. And that is to what Moody's is referring. What is consistently being misrepresented in this discussion about finances is that the expenses associated with these 7 schools are being paid by the charter. Whether those expenses are being paid to you in the form of the required maintenance fee associated with the charter or the transportation fee associated with the charter, they show up on the expense side of the budget that we have presented to you. So the only expenses that we are not accommodating in this budget are the expenses that are not school related. And those are choices we've made. The other problem is, and this is consistent with what's happened for this entire hearing, quite frankly, and with all due respect, Mr. Thurman, you have dramatically misrepresented the process. You had a long discussion about class sizes a minute ago, and on both objects of class size, teacher salary and student-teacher ratio, your own staff said we met the requirement. In the document that they gave us, they said we met the requirement. So if you want to know why this is confusing to us, and certainly confusing to the people that are watching this, it's because it is completely inconsistent. We handed you a charter on August 16th. You did not interact with us from a staff perspective until the middle of October, despite multiple requests to do so to this board and to the staff. And when you interacted with us, you gave us a report that said, at least in those 2 cases, we met the requirements for class size and salaries. And then Dr. Beasley preached on and on about how we were in trouble in that regard. So if you see us with odd looks on our faces, that's why.
Okay. Mr. Comer.
My last question. My last question is for Dr. Beasley. My background is limited. Can you explain what your point of references are in section, I guess it's Exhibit 4, sections 21, when you talk about Title I and Title III, the difference between the district and the charter?
In reference to Exhibit 4, number 21, he specifically just outlined that within the charter proposal, there are no unique strategies that specifically address the needs of those students identified as economically disadvantaged and or low performing. Strategies offered, again, are a continuation of strategies that are currently utilized within our school district. And while they do plan to address the needs of the students using currently DeKalb's Flexible Learning Plan, REP, and EIP, it stops short of extending beyond in order to what we determine as innovative, as unique. It stops short of that.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
His response to that, and then Mr. Coleman.
We're back to the fundamental inherent problem. The petition requests permission to convert 7 schools. The organization and the budget is designed to support a startup charter. That is the fundamental problem that has been consistent, that we as a district cannot, based on the evidence and the documents we have, resolve. That's what Dr. Bell has continued to talk about. That's what I'm saying, and that's what is in fact the most fundamental deficit that we can't say. And the problem is, if this board decides to approve it as a conversion, we have no authority to prevent it from being funded as a startup.
One I don't think we broached tonight, and I believe this will be either council or Mr. Ramsey, if you could address this. Certainly it's covered in the materials, but there are situations under which we can terminate a charter prior to the 5-year reexamination period. So I know after 5 years we have the opportunity to either accept or reject an extension of the charter. But in the interim, there seems to be recourse under several circumstances, including financial mismanagement, ethical issues, safety issues, etc. Briefly, and just on this specific topic, and both sides are welcome to respond, what, as you understand them, are the situations in which we could terminate a charter before that 5-year reexamination period.
For calls on
Mr. Coleman, the grounds to terminate a charter are set forth in 20-2-2068, and I think it's very important to understand the school district has no authority to terminate a charter. They can recommend termination of charters, but only the state board can terminate a charter. So approving it, you are then living with it, and then you would have a chance at renewal or non-renewal. The state board, you can recommend to the state board or request that it be terminated, and the grounds for those, basically there can be a vote of the school community to seek termination of the charter, and then there is a list of other, a whole series of factors that would go into financial, certainly mismanagement, poor governance, certainly a failure to meet goals set forth in the charter. Those would be grounds not meeting federal state laws that apply to the charter, not following material terms of the charter, really any terms of the charter, contract. Those would be grounds among others that are laid out in statute. But I think the important point I'd like to emphasize is the board, this board, does not have the authority to terminate. It can ask for termination. Only the state board can make that decision.
Do the petitioners have a different view, or is that substantively the same?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Coleman and Board. I'm David Moore. I appreciate the chance to speak tonight. Under OCGA 22-2068, I would agree with Mr. Testani that there are mechanisms for termination of a charter, but I have a different view. In a recent study of over 30 of all 50 states, Georgia has a more robust charter termination standard and provision than most states. Charters can be terminated for several reasons. They can be initiated by this board. The State Department of Education sits in appellate capacity. That is still a decision that can be made by this board. A charter can also be terminated by vote of the parents. It can also be terminated by vote of the community. It can also be terminated for not being in the public interest. And so this is the reason why scholars and educators have stated that Georgia has one of the most robust charter termination provisions of any state that has charter schools.
My second question is on an unrelated topic, and I think this may be Dr. Beasley or another member of staff, and then also for the petitioners. One thing I haven't heard discussed at length, a benefit that I saw laid out in the petition that I don't think was, or it may have been addressed, and I'd like to hear you speak to that, was the effective implementation of school choice K through 5, as you termed it, I believe, in the petition, because people could choose multiple pathways and interchange between the elementary schools in question. So I guess my question for both sides is, how would you characterize that ability? Would you characterize it as effectively school choice? And if so or if not, does that construe any sort of innovation for the system, or do you believe that that's available in the broader system today?
I would conclude that upon looking at what's being offered by the petitioner and what we're doing, school choice, as clearly outlined in Exhibit 4, number 18. It's comparable with the petitioner planning to allow 9th grade students in need of additional student support to attend Cross Keys outside of the proposed charter cluster or similar program that may be developed within the proposed cluster. School choice related to the instructional pathways, again, would be a continuation of the current options that are available within the DeKalb County School District.
Can I, just a quick clarification, my reading of the petition, whether it's true or not, and that's my question to you, is the petitioner stated because K through 5 offers, I believe it's 5 options amongst the elementary schools, and there's a process by which elementary school students can interchange between those schools in the different pathways, that presents school choice. I understand the Cross Keys discussion that you just had, but specifically, do you believe it's true or false that that represents school choice? And if so, why is that not an innovation? And if not, why is that widely available, or where is that widely available through the system?
again, as noted in the handout, it does offer school choice. However, DeKalb County currently offers broad access to all students to school choice, including magnet theme, Montessori, IB, etc. We consider that a continuation of what is currently being done in DeKalb County School District. Mind you, that there are always opportunities, even within our current district. It's within our purview to have conversations about enhancing or expanding school choice options.
Would the petitioners offer any different interpretation on this specific topic, in this topic?
DeKalb County does not currently offer elementary choice for learning pathways. DeKalb County currently offers choice where there is capacity available on a lottery basis if a school offers something you don't have at your home school. Our petition makes learning pathways at all 5 elementary schools available to any student in those elementary schools, and we provide transportation, which DeKalb County does not do today. It's innovative in that we have chosen learning pathways at each elementary school geographically, and by need at that school and by demand from the parents. So this is driven from the grassroots. If your home school is a learning pathway that doesn't suit your child, you don't have to go to a lottery. You may use one of the other elementary schools in the cluster, and we provide you with transportation.
Dr. Irwin.
Yeah, I have a couple questions for the petitioners. Speaking on your K through 5 school choice, I just need to know how you're going to work it out logistically. Can somebody give me an explanation?
So there's currently capacity at all of our 7 schools with the... Sorry? Hello? Hello? So there's currently capacity at 6 of our 7 schools. I can't get any closer. We're going to have a...
Is there another mic? Can you borrow the mic?
So we currently have capacity at 6 of our 7 schools. The high school, based on the capacity study from the county, does not have capacity. We logistically chose the learning pathway schools by geography within our footprint and by need and by parental demand. And we did that intentionally so that we were minimizing travel distances from each of our learning pathway schools to the other. There are 5 schools, but there are 3 distinct learning pathways. So there are 2 schools that are IB, there are 2 schools that are STEAM, and there's 1 that's Montessori. And we've arranged those in a way, we believe, that logistically you're always close enough to be transported to one of the schools that meets your learning pathway requirement if your home school does not.
And if not?
Beg your pardon?
If you're not close enough?
We believe you will be close enough.
Second question. Can I get some details on your improvement of parental involvement? You need the mic.
My name is Teresa Bennett. What we're going to have is school leadership teams at each school. They will be composed of parents, teachers, and the principal. We will have a say in what is going on. We will present, parents will present findings and other things to the principal to be implemented in our school. If a parent finds a new system at another school in another state, she or he will bring the information to our school so that our principal can study it to see if it can be implemented in our school or any one of the other cluster schools.
Follow-up question to that. How do you get parents engaged that are not engaged?
Right now, as a parent who got parents from my school semi-engaged, it was hard work. We rallied up. I had to do grassroots, knocking on doors, carpool lanes, visiting apartment complexes, sending out notes, sending out signs, going to after-school programs, going to churches, making sure that parents knew what was going on. Not everybody came. Some people just won't come. But we put the information there for them to know what was going on with the petition. And I made myself available to any parent or anybody who wanted to find out information about the petition.
Not referring to the petition, referring to parents that are not active in the schools now.
We're going to have to do the same thing we're doing now. Recruit them. Work hard to recruit them and hold them accountable.
So I'll go back to the statement you made. You did it with the petition. You said some parents came out something different. Do you have new strategies to make sure more parents come out?
Well, our strategy is to let them know you will have a say on how your school is running. Some parents don't feel like they have a say in what's going on. If we give them more time and more duties and require more of them, they may step up to the plate.
Okay. I have a third question. I think I'm limited to 3, right? Three. I got you 3. And if the petition is granted, and let's say one of the elementary schools you go into, what is your timeline for assessing students and implementing strategy to increase academic success? Because you're talking about a great academic rise within a year. So what is the timeline to get that done? And if you don't mind elaborating on some of the strategies.
Certainly. And also, just to double back on the question you just asked, part of the beauty of the cluster model is that it ties together these 7 schools. So while we talk about the recruiting strategies for the parents, we now have a force of numbers that's available because it's not just in the interest of one school, it's in the interest of all schools to get that parent involvement up. So where you've traditionally seen very high levels of parent engagement, for example, at a Fernbank Elementary, that now extends itself to the cluster. With respect to your second question, assessment in particular, you probably noticed within the petition a very strong focus on the formative assessment and the growth measures, the MAP assessment in particular, that would be administered 3 times throughout the year. That is a continuous vertical scale that goes across K-12. It gives you an indication at 3 different points across the year of the kind of growth you're seeing, where it is at a domain level from an academic perspective so that you can break down your flexible grouping, your differentiated instruction, and move things around so that you can tailor that instruction and that ongoing assessment to the needs of kids and push for continued growth.
Thank you.
If we may, Dr. Irwin, I would like for Dr. Beasley to respond to what we are doing, particularly in the Title I schools. And I want to just personally say it was a point of concern that the petitioners failed to note that 4 of the 7 schools are Title I schools, and in fact, based on current demographic trends, 5 of the 7 schools will be Title I schools next year. And that, as you know, is where we had the biggest challenges in terms of parental engagement, and there was no specific plan to address that. And I'll have Dr. Beasley to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Thurman. As it pertains to parent engagement involvement, we recognize that it is often a challenge to pull certain parents into the conversation. It should be noted that at every school we have school leadership teams, so parents currently have every opportunity to be involved in decision making at the school level. It should be noted also that our Title I schools have budgets that support parent engagement, and at the district level we now have a budget that supports parent involvement. That budget is being utilized to engage our parents in training, conferences, meetings, staff development within the district, beyond the district. That budget is also being utilized to implement or re-implement our parent centers. On November 16th, we will have our fall parent involvement conference, and parents will be uniquely asked to share with us what they would like to see offered in those parent centers. So our parents will be the drivers of the plan. In addition to that, we are using a variety of tools to communicate with our parents. We are translating documents, not only just in Spanish. As I noted, the petitioner did one language for their initial survey.
but we translate surveys and documents in a minimum of 10 languages. And we consistently do that to ensure that we engage our parents within their native language. It's important to note that we, as I mentioned earlier, that we are using what we call innovation grants, where we're asking principals to partner with the community organizations to basically identify an innovative strategy or approach that would support some of the most at-risk students, whether they're identified as economically disadvantaged or underperforming. Additionally, within our federal budgets, we are addressing professional learning. We are, as we prepare to roll out many of the instructional resources, we have planned to implement within our rollout waves, the fourth wave being to ensure that our parents are knowledgeable and informed about the tools that teachers will be using in the classroom. Mentoring will be a component of our parent involvement. We're also looking at extending or implementing in our district what we call Jobs for Georgia Graduate Centers. As you well know, that's a transition school to work transition. It has a very strong parent component as well. So our parents are really the drivers of our parent engagement. Our parents understand and are being informed that there are numerous opportunities for them to be involved in the process. Not only are we doing parent involvement meetings in October, as we traditionally have done once a year, but we are planning those meetings throughout the year. We were pleased at our last parent involvement meeting, October 22nd, while in previous years there were maybe 4 or 5 individuals to show up. We're pleased to share that this auditorium was half full at our last parent involvement meeting. So we're using these strategies and we're seeing the evidence of our efforts. Okay. I'm sure if I think of others, they'll come to mind.
No further questions. At this time, I call for a motion to adjourn the committee of the whole for the purpose of reconvening the DeKalb meeting. Moved by Dr. Irwin, second by Dr. Carter. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I call for the vote. Let us know by show of hands, if you will. Mr. Coleman? That's unanimous. Mr. Thurman? We're back to, I'm sorry.
So we're going to take a break. Can we just take a break?
We'll take a short break and we will reconvene in about 5 minutes.